Claude Bernard was the founding figure of modern physiology. Bernard's approach to physiology was experimental and skeptical. In one sense, this was a radical departure in mindset and technique, but in another sense, he was very much a product of his times. He didn't mind getting up to his elbows, so to speak, into a problem, literally up to his elbows, in fact. He was a skilled surgeon, and he used his skill to devise clever experiments that allowed him new ways to peer into the workings of the body. He was also well versed in the emerging chemistry of life, and this gave him an analytical ability to interpret his surgical experiments also in unprecedented ways. It's my contention that a coherent theory of evolution demands a full understanding of Bernard and his thought. There's a bit of a paradox here, though. Bernard was not an evolutionist. In fact, he regarded the whole topic as speculative and unimportant. So, why should we pay attention to Claude Bernard? Well, here's why. Bernard was not simply a brilliant experimentalist and scientist. He was also one of the earliest of the modern scientists to ask the deceptively simple question, what is life? Some aspects of Bernard's answer to this question do not sit comfortably in our modern scientific age, and this has made Bernard a widely misunderstood figure. It has also made his answer to this question one of the most widely misunderstood and trivialized concepts of modern biology. Homeostasis is the name we give to this idea, although Bernard himself did not use that term. Nevertheless, homeostasis, as Bernard himself understood it, is the key to developing a coherent theory of life. This includes a coherent theory of adaptation and therefore of evolution. In particular, homeostasis provides a rational framework for incorporating intentionality and purposefulness into our thinking about evolution. Claude Bernard was born in 1813 in Saint-Julien, a small village north of Lyon in the province of Rhône, in the Beaujolais region. He's honored there by a statue in the town square. His parents were employed on a large wine estate there. By all accounts, Bernard's upbringing was conventional. He was educated in a local Jesuit school, but by his own account, he found that relentlessly boring. Looking for something else to do, he followed the advice of a friend to become an apothecary's apprentice in one of the suburbs of Lyon. It would be a good-paying job, and it would get him off the farm, so to speak. That venture did not really go very well, though. To the young Bernard, pharmacy would be what we now would call a day job that would allow him to pursue his real interest, romantic literature, and his aspirations to become a playwright. When the apothecary discovered him working on his script rather than mixing remedies, Bernard was shown the door. The break was probably mutual. Bernard had become disillusioned with the whole apothecary business, which he thought to be rather a slapdash affair. Bernard himself would write about remedies, sometimes including mixing in sweepings from the apothecary floor. Maybe that was the arrogance of youth speaking. Nevertheless, adventure does always beckon to youth, and this set the stage for Bernard's next steps. 19th century France was a pretty tumultuous place. There was the French Revolution, obviously, the Napoleonic Wars, the stop-and-go restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, and the fitful attempts to establish a republic. But it was also a time of new and emerging opportunities for a young man on the make. France was becoming increasingly industrialized and urbanized. Power and money were gathering in Paris. For an ambitious young man looking to escape the serene Beaujolais countryside, Paris beckoned irresistibly. So, with his play tucked under his arm, he decamped to the capital for a hopeful future career in the Paris theater. His draft play was titled Arthur de Bretagne, or Arthur of Brittany. The subject of his play, Arthur I, was the 12th century Duke of Brittany, and he was caught up in the intrigues of succession to the British throne, which pitted Richard I against his younger brother, John. Arthur was a claimant to the British throne. John thought the throne belonged to him. So Arthur ended up murdered by John and his body dumped in the Seine. In short, the makings of a great play, right? Well, not so fast. Bernard's dreams of a glittering theatrical career were quickly dashed when he showed his script to a prominent Parisian cultural critic. This man, Saint-Marc Girardin, recognized in Bernard a young man of obvious intelligence and talent. His talents, alas, did not lie in writing plays. So he advised Bernard to seek a career in medicine instead, which launched him on his trajectory to fame. Bernard's play, by the way, was eventually published after he died, when his fame could not be diminished by the release. To support himself in his medical studies, Bernard found various forms of work. He worked in a Parisian girls' school for a time, preparing dissections for laboratory exercises. He also apprenticed himself as a preparateur in the medical school, where he came under the influence of this man, François Magendie. We'll have more to say about Magendie momentarily. To put it succinctly, Bernard's talent at the laboratory bench impressed Magendie so much that he took on Bernard as his personal apprentice. And from there, Bernard's rise in French science was steady and impressive. For the first part of his career, his fame rose on the strength of his scientific contributions. In his later years, he turned to those more philosophical issues, which were centered around the question of common and general principles of all life. Claude Bernard was a product of his times, and he's best understood in that context. He was also a product of his professional relationships, mostly with François Magendie, who was Bernard's inspiration and mentor. Magendie was older than Bernard. The radical rationalism that permeated the French Revolution was his mother's milk, so to speak. His father had been a physician from Bordeaux. When the revolution broke out, he quit his practice to move to Paris to become a bureaucrat in France's new Republican government. By all accounts, he was a zealous partisan for the revolution, and François inherited some of that zealotry, along with his father's obstreperousness and tendency to radical thought. It was a perfect time for someone like Magendie to study medicine. This was a time that the philosophical underpinnings of medicine were undergoing a radical change, and it was helped along by the intellectual turmoil of the revolution. At the time, medicine was emerging from the vitalist philosophy that had prevailed into the 18th century, with its reliance on ineffable vital forces and essences, essential or metaphysical vitalism, as I've described it. These came under attack during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and one of the prominent bomb throwers was François Magendie. Magendie brought to the debate a strenuous skepticism of theory, a strict materialism, and a conviction that the only things that mattered in science were phenomena which could be demonstrated by experiment. He also brought with him a rough and rash personal disposition that made him many enemies. He could be blunt in his criticism and sarcastic in his dismissals of other people's ideas. He always had a troubled relationship with the medical community of his time. No surprise. He was repeatedly denied the opportunity to practice in hospitals because the resident physicians wanted nothing to do with him. It was only later in his life, once he presumably had mellowed with age, that Magendie was allowed hospital privileges. Nevertheless, Magendie's brashness could not hide his obvious brilliance, and it was that combination of rash personality, flamboyance in debate, and aggressive skepticism that drew the young and ambitious Claude Bernard to Magendie, like the proverbial moth to the flame. In turn, Magendie recognized Bernard's skill and sharp mind, and it was through Magendie that Bernard was able to develop his own experimental philosophy. The relationship was not always smooth. Bernard had been raised in a more conservative cultural climate than Magendie had been, The Beaujolais countryside was far removed from the turmoil of revolutionary Paris, and Bernard himself never shook his strong romantic streak. Every year he would return to Beaujolais to refresh himself. He retained a deep feeling of attachment to the place and to its nature. For Bernard, it was that combination of romanticism and rationality that leavened the development of his own unique philosophy. Our conventional view of both Magendie and Bernard regards them as anti-vitalists. They were grounded in the physical world and in what could be demonstrated by experiment. No vital essences or strange vital forces for them. The description is more apt for Magendie than it is for Bernard, however. It's Bernard's persistent romantic streak that explains the difference. Both Bernard and Magendie were reacting against a form of vitalism, metaphysical vitalism, that was already in eclipse. This did not mean that vitalism was a dead issue, however. Both men were, in fact, immersed in another form of vitalism, the new process vitalism that had emerged from Montpellier University. For all their insistence that the study of life had to be firmly grounded in the physical world, both Magendie and Bernard were sympathetic to the idea that life itself was a phenomenon distinct from the material world. And this is the essence of the vitalist idea, what we might call vitalism light. In the 19th century, the emerging process vitalism put flesh on that bare-bones idea. What made life unique were the processes that underlay them, Bourdieu's many little lives doctrine. We'll be returning to this in the next episode. Suffice it to say for now that process vitalism was the foundation of 19th century biology, and Bernard stands out because he took the idea of process vitalism further than Magendie was willing to. Bernard, more than any of his contemporaries, made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled vitalist. And in this sense, Bernard vindicated vitalism as a scientifically credible philosophy. In his later years, Bernard turned to more philosophical issues about life and its nature. Bernard described himself as a searcher for general, that is to say, universal properties of life. And this is embodied in his own description of his work as general physiology, the emphasis being on that word general. To illustrate, let's ask, what should be the proper experimental subjects for understanding how human beings worked? Or, more to the point for physicians, how they failed to work? Would human beings therefore be the only proper experimental subjects for human physiology? Other creatures also had physiology. What about dogs or cats? Would they have anything to teach us about humans worked? For that matter, why not birds or fish or reptiles? And while we're at it, microbes have their own life and function, as do plants. Why not them? Each type of organism has its own peculiarities of function and dysfunction. We can study these creatures for their peculiarities. For example, birds lay eggs, humans do not. So if we want to understand how eggs are produced, we should study birds, not humans. The same goes for other forms of life. If you study, as Louis Pasteur did, why fermented grapes sometimes made wine and at others made vinegar, would that have any applicability to human physiology? And the same goes for plants. And so on and so on. The basic question now stands out. Is there anything about the physiology of plants, microbes, birds, turtles, trout that could illuminate the physiology of people? That was Bernard's basic question. Are there physiological principles that humans hold in common with other mammals so that the physiology of, say, dogs or cats actually can teach us something about the physiology of people? For that matter, why not all of animal life? And why stop at animals? Are there general properties of all life that can unite the physiology of all life under one comprehensive, that is to say, general physiology? As you might guess, we're edging up to vitalism here. What is it about life itself that makes it distinct from all other phenomena in the universe? And this was the philosophical question that Bernard was asking. And Bernard, being concerned with the processes of life, was aligning himself fully with the process vitalism that then dominated 19th century biology. Bernard identified a principle, which has come to be called homeostasis. Although Bernard himself did not use that term came only in the early 20th century. We're going to go into Bernard's principle of homeostasis in some detail in the next episode. But for now, let's just lay out Bernard's own assertion of his principle in the form of a famous aphorism which belies the notion that Bernard was an anti-vitalist. Here it is. The constancy of the internal environment is the condition for a free and independent life. There's more to the quote than this. He goes on to say, the mechanism that makes it possible is that which assured the maintenance within the internal environment of all the conditions necessary for the life of the elements. And there's still more. The constancy of the environment presupposes a perfection of the organism, such that external variations are at every instant compensated and brought into balance. In consequence, far from being indifferent to the external world, the higher animal is, on the contrary, in a close and wise relationship to it, so that its equilibrium results from a continuous and delicate compensation, established as if the most sensitive of balances. Scattered in these sentences are the clues to Bernard's vitalist thinking. Keep these in mind, because we'll be coming back to them in the next episode. They are key to understanding Bernard's fundamentally weird idea of homeostasis and how this leads us into a deeper and more biological understanding of evolution.